Bible Study, Chapter 11. Paul unavoidably defends his apostleship. The zeal of the apostle to beware of a different gospel and keep a pure faith toward Christ. Oh, that you would bear with me in a little folly, and indeed you do bear with me. For I am jealous for you with godly jealousy. For I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. But I fear, lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. For if he who comes preaches another Jesus whom we have not preached, or if you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you may well put up with it. For I consider that I am not at all inferior to the most eminent apostles. Even though I am untrained in speech, yet I am not in knowledge. But we have been thoroughly manifested among you in all things. Did I commit sin in humbling myself, that you might be exalted, because I preached the gospel of God to you free of charge? I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to minister to you. And when I was present with you and in need, I was a burden to no one. For what I lacked the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied. And in everything I kept myself from being burdensome to you, and so I will keep myself. As the truth of Christ is in me, no one shall stop me from this boasting in the regions of Achaia. Why? Because I do not love you? God knows. But what I do, I will also continue to do, that I may cut off the opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the things of which they boast. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ. And no wonder. For Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 1 through 15. When looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 1 through 15, from the perspective of the gospel of the water and the Spirit, this word is a text showing the zeal of a shepherd intended not for the Apostle Paul to assert his own apostolic authority, but to make the church not be deceived by a different gospel and keep the true gospel. At the center of this word, the zeal of the apostle trying to keep a pure faith toward Christ and the warning against a different gospel appear. First, Paul says toward the church of Corinth, "For I am jealous for you with godly jealousy." This means that he loves the church with the heart given by God, not simple human passion. Paul says that he is a matchmaker to present the church of Corinth as a pure virgin to Christ, who is one husband. Here, the church is compared to the bride of Christ. The role of the apostle is not to make the church belong to himself, but to prepare it as a community belonging to Christ. When looking from the perspective of the gospel of the water and the Spirit, the reason the church becomes the bride of Christ is because Jesus Christ saved the believers by bearing the sins of the world, by receiving baptism, and receiving the judgment of those sins on the cross. The people who believe that gospel receive the elimination of sin, become reconciled with God, and become the people belonging to Christ. Therefore, the church is not a simple religious organization, but a community preparing as the bride of Christ. However, Paul speaks of one fear. He says that he fears that just as the serpent deceived Eve by craftiness, the minds of the saints might leave the sincerity and purity toward Christ and become corrupted. This shows that even a person who believes the gospel of the water and the Spirit can have his mind shaken by false teachings and a different gospel. Therefore, Paul gives a very important warning. It is that some people are coming and preaching another Jesus, a different spirit, and a different gospel, and the saints are easily accepting it. The different gospel spoken of here does not mean simply a different religious teaching, but means a teaching that alters the word of the gospel of salvation of Jesus Christ. When looking from the perspective of the gospel of the water and the Spirit, a different gospel is a teaching that blurs the gospel of salvation completed through the baptism and the cross of Jesus Christ, or adds human deeds and merit. The true gospel is the gospel that Jesus Christ gave perfect salvation to the believers by bearing the sins of the world with the baptism received from John and receiving the judgment of sin on the cross. However, a different gospel tries to blur this gospel of the water and the Spirit, or establish human righteousness. Paul admits that he is not excellent in speech. However, he says that he is not lacking regarding the gospel of the water and the Spirit. When he preached the gospel of the water and the Spirit in the church of Corinth, he preached the gospel without charge. He did missions at his own expense in order not to give a burden to the saints. This means that Paul's ministry was not for his own benefit, but was a pure ministry for the gospel. Paul also says that some people are seeking an opportunity, wanting to criticize Paul. However, he says that he will continue to preach the gospel of the water and the Spirit to them with the same attitude. The reason is to cut off the opportunity of the false apostles. Paul calls them false apostles and deceitful workers. Outwardly, they look like apostles of Christ, but in reality, they were not. Paul says that this is not a strange thing, because Satan also disguises himself as an angel of light. Therefore, the workers of Satan also have the ability to look like workers of righteousness. This word shows a very important spiritual fact. False teaching always reveals itself in an appearance looking like the truth. Therefore, the church must not judge by outward appearance or the ability of speech, but must discern whether the content of the gospel is true. When looking from the perspective of the gospel of the water and the Spirit, the true gospel is the gospel that perfectly testifies to the ministry of salvation of Jesus Christ. It is that Jesus had the sins of the world transferred to him by receiving baptism from John and received the judgment of those sins on the cross instead of us. Sometimes there are also times when we leave this word of the gospel of the water and the Spirit and receive a different teaching. We must discern that such a person places his purpose in making us move far away from the truth. Therefore, Paul's zeal is not simply to protect his own authority, but that he had to fight spiritually so that the church would keep the true gospel. He tried to protect God's church so that it would not lose the pure word of the gospel toward Christ. Ultimately, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 1 through 15, shows an important fact that the church must always remember. The church must exert much effort in discerning the true gospel of the water and the Spirit among the many teachings of the world, and keeping the faith that believes it. And the saint must not place his own faith on human teachings or outward ability, but must place it upon the gospel of the water and the Spirit of Jesus Christ. When doing so, the church comes to stand as a community keeping a pure faith toward Christ, and becomes a community prepared before God as the bride of Christ. The true boast of the apostle revealed in weakness and the hardships of the gospel ministry. I say again, let no one think me a fool. If otherwise, at least receive me as a fool, that I also may boast a little. What I speak not according to the Lord, but as it were foolishly in this confidence of boasting. Seeing that many boast according to the flesh, I also will boast. For you put up with fools gladly, since you yourselves are wise. For you put up with it if one brings you into bondage, if one devours you, if one takes from you, if one exalts himself, if one strikes you on the face. To our shame I say that we were too weak for that. But in whatever anyone is bold, I speak foolishly. I am bold also. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more, in labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Besides the other things, what comes upon me daily? My deep concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble, and I do not burn with indignation? If I must boast, I will boast in the things which concern my infirmity. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. In Damascus, the governor, under Aretas the king, was guarding the city of the Damascenes with a garrison, desiring to arrest me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped from his hands. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 16 through 33. When looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 30 through 33, from the perspective of the gospel of the water and the Spirit, this word is a text showing the fact that the Apostle Paul is not simply recording his own hardships, but what kind of nature the true gospel ministry has, and that ministry is accomplished not by human ability, but by the grace of God. Paul does not intend to boast of himself, but is speaking of the work of God revealed through his own weakness. First, Paul says, "If I must boast, I will boast in the things which concern my infirmity." At that time inside the church, there were false apostles who boasted of their own ability and authority. They tried to exercise influence over people by boasting of their eloquence and outward authority or religious background. However, Paul does not try to prove himself in such a way. Rather, he boasts of his own weakness. When looking from the perspective of the gospel of the water and the Spirit, this shows a very important principle of the gospel. The gospel of the water and the Spirit is a grace of salvation accomplished not by human ability or righteousness, but by the ministry of Jesus Christ. By receiving baptism from John, Jesus Christ bore the sins of the world, and by receiving the judgment of those sins on the cross, he saved sinners from sin. Humans cannot add any merit to saving sinners from sin. Therefore, the ministry preaching the gospel also cannot become a ministry where human ability or boasting becomes the center. The reason Paul boasts of his own weakness is exactly because of this. The gospel ministry does not come from human strength, but comes from the grace and power of God. When a person boasts of his own strength, the person is revealed more than God. But when a person acknowledges his own weakness, the power of God appears more clearly. Paul goes on to speak of the numerous hardships he experienced in his own life. He was beaten, imprisoned, and went through the danger of death several times. He was beaten by the Jews, beaten with Roman rods, and was even stoned. A ship was shipwrecked, and he spent a night and a day in the sea. During his journeys, he went through numerous perils such as perils of robbers, perils of his own countrymen, and perils of Gentiles. Also, even in hunger, cold, and weariness, he lived for the propagation of the gospel. These hardships show the reality of the gospel ministry. The ministry of preaching the gospel of the water and the Spirit is not a path of obtaining the world's recognition and comfort, but a path where one must endure hardships in order to keep the truth, because the gospel tears down human religious righteousness and boasting. Because people intend to keep their own righteousness, they also oppose the true gospel of the water and the Spirit. However, the greatest burden to Paul was not these outward hardships. He says, "Besides the other things, what comes upon me daily? My deep concern for all the churches." This shows the heart of a shepherd. Because Paul wanted the church to stand upon the gospel, he had a deep sense of responsibility and love for the church. Therefore, he says, "Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble, and I do not burn with indignation?" The gospel minister is not simply a person who preaches the word, but a person who feels the spiritual state of the saints together and aches together. In Paul's heart, there was a deep love toward the church. Lastly, Paul speaks of the incident he went through in Damascus. In the danger of being caught by the king's official, he fled by going down in a basket through a window of the city wall. Looking by the standard of the world, this is a very miserable appearance. However, Paul speaks without hiding even such an incident. He does not hide his own weakness, and testifies to the fact that God protected him even in the midst of that weakness. When looking from the perspective of the gospel of the water and the Spirit, Paul's life shows the essence of the gospel ministry. The gospel ministry is a work accomplished not by human ability and boasting, but a ministry accomplished by the grace and power of God. Therefore, the true minister does not boast of his own strength, but boasts of the work that God has accomplished. Ultimately, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 30 through 33, shows an important fact. At the center of the gospel ministry, there is not human glory, but God's grace of salvation. And God sometimes manifests his own power through human weakness. Therefore, the Apostle Paul was not ashamed of his own weakness, but rather boasted of God's work that appeared in the midst of that weakness. This exactly is the characteristic of the minister preaching the gospel of the water and the Spirit. The gospel does not start from human ability, but starts from the ministry of salvation of Jesus Christ and the grace of God. Therefore, the gospel minister becomes a person who lives relying not on his own strength, but on the grace of God,